You are listening to WRFG Atlanta. WRFG provides a voice for those who have been traditionally denied open access to the broadcast media through the involvement of a broad base of community elements to guarantee that access. In the utilization of the facilities and its programs, the following communities will receive first priority: those who continue to be denied free and open access to the broadcast media, and those who suffer oppression or exploitation based upon class, race, sex, age, creed, disability, sexual orientation, or immigrant status.
My name is Heather Gray. The program is Just Peace, and I'm pleased to say that this evening we're going to be talking with another WRFG producer, actually, Dazon Dixon Diallo. This evening, we're going to primarily talk about the overturning of Roe v. Wade recently in the Supreme Court, but Dazon has a long history of working with women. She was the founder of Sister Love, the co-founder of Sister Song, co-founder of the 14th Strategy, global convener, movement strategist, researcher, all kinds of background of her amazing work. So we're going to get some of that this evening, but primarily we're going to talk about Roe v. Wade and the impact of overturning this decision. Anyway, Dazon, welcome. And I want to tell everyone as well that I'm talking with Dazon, but she is actually in South Africa right now. So want to find out a little bit more about what she's doing there also. She's been going back and forth to South Africa and Southern Africa, I think, quite a bit, probably more also on the whole continent, but we'll get some of that background information from her. Anyway, Dazon, welcome. Thank you so much for talking with us this evening.
Thank you so very much, Heather. It's great to be here with you.
Well, thank you. So tell us what you are, in fact, doing in South Africa right now. What's your mission? What's your goal? What are you doing?
Certainly. Well, I am currently here in South Africa because there's a lot of things, but I came over for a couple of meetings specifically around some new HIV science or HIV prevention research that's happening with some pretty novel drugs that are just starting to go into clinical trial. And why these meetings are so important and why this particular set of clinical trials is so important is because it's I think probably one of the next most important prevention studies that will be done that is highly focused and centered in on cisgendered women or people who were assigned female at birth. And so it's really powerful. You know, we have a lot of prevention tools in the pipeline, not enough on the streets in terms of preventing HIV and improving sexual health outcomes. So to make that a little shorter, you currently have 2 different drugs that can be made available to people who are not living with HIV to prevent getting HIV, regardless of their sexual exposures, by taking a pill every day or getting an injection every 2 months. Well, this new formulation that's just going into clinical trial, and one of the earliest is directly sponsored by the pharmaceutical, so they're challenged to get it right, is potential injection that could last for 6 months, or even possibly an oral pill that you could take every 6 months or once a year. So it would really revolutionize how people engage in prevention around HIV, and the fact that it could even possibly grow into preventing pregnancy at the same time so that we can have a contraceptive HIV prevention would be phenomenal. So we do a lot of community engagement work. And so we had some community advisory board meetings this week and some activists organizing around ensuring equity and justice, not only during the trial, but to ensure that the people who represent and participate in the studies are also first in line for the drugs if they work and when they're approved. Because that begins to be the challenge. We have, Heather, there's currently how do I want to say it? So there's a vaginal ring that's very much similar to the contraceptive ring that has now been proven efficacious against HIV, but the FDA has declined to approve it, has basically outright said it won't be approved in the US, which means we've added another option for women's prevention that U.S. women will not have access to. So we've got a lot of fight. A lot of people don't hear and see us when we're in our activist mode around research, but this is what it looks like. It's still about equity. It's still about inclusion, and it's still about justice in terms of how we're talking about getting to the end of an HIV epidemic when we can't even figure out ways to make sure that women are included.
Wow. It's a challenge, that's for sure. Well, Dazon, let's talk about Roe v. Wade. So what's your opinion about this overturning in the Supreme Court? I mean, my goodness, I guess folks were expecting this. We were all expecting this, given the information that we had been receiving. But what's your opinion about this?
So, well, my opinion isn't specifically around the Roe v. Wade question of it so much, because quite frankly, Heather, for Black women, and this is for Black women in the U.S. and around the world, even on the continent of Africa, what we represent is the people who are most affected and least protected by having no access to safe and legal abortion. In the United States, it looks like, what it looks like by not having federal support through the Hyde Amendment's restrictions for poor and low income or no health insurance coverage people in the United States. And in other places, it looks even worse, especially on the continent, in terms of what options or choices women don't have. So the Roe question is one of those things. When the leak, for example, came out last month, we had a big call the day after the leak of the Alito opinion. And when everybody got on the phone, and this was all the Black reproductive justice leaders, we were basically, when we were asked the question, well, what are we thinking? How are we feeling? Half of us were like, well, it's Tuesday, right? So when it comes to the Roe question in the Supreme Court, how could we have not known and seen this was coming for years? My opinion on this is that I completely hold accountable, including what people may consider themselves as our allies or our co-conspirators. They're not. I completely hold accountable the white, liberal, feminist base of the reproductive rights movement that was so myopic over the time that they didn't pay attention to how concomitant the issues around voting rights, the issues around pay equity, the issues around housing equity, that all of these issues are based in racism, that they're based in an overarching strategy to secure and ensure a white, male, patriarchal, supremacist-led United States. And so my opinion comes to, where the F have our people been? And the day that you are now seeing as a next reckoning is almost the same level as the reckoning that happened after George Floyd, that we've been trying to say these things for decades, but because we didn't matter in the full scale of the fight to protect access to abortion and all of the other intersections that requires us to pay attention to, this is why we are here. And if you are naive enough to think that this is the end of their fight to restrict abortion, it is only the next step. It's not even the beginning. They started this 70 years ago, not 50, 70 years ago, to dismantle the democracy that we are so aspiring to be in order for them to remain in power. The Constitution was never written to include anyone but white men who owned land. And these are the same people who are making decisions and influencing the minds and the decisions of others. And I just lay that at the feet of people like Amy Coney Bryant. And I lay this at the feet of people like, well, I don't even know what to say about Justice Thomas, but at the feet of people like even this guy, Herschel Walker, running for office. that you're betraying the very essence of where we're supposed to be going as a country. That's my opinion. It is that we right now are cannon fodder for the future apartheid state that they are hoping to build in the United States.
Wow. Thank you for all of that, Dazon. So with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, though, I guess the question also is, what on earth are women going to do? I mean, what options are they if they get pregnant? As Dr. King would say, where do we go from here? I mean,
right. Yeah, so that's actually a better question than what we think about this court decision, because I will also say that from a reproductive justice standpoint, especially from a Black reproductive justice standpoint, we have been for over 25 years stating the case that the decision called Roe versus Wade was never enough to protect abortion rights. It protected abortion access. It protected abortion rights for some, but it was never enough to cover bodily autonomy, women's human rights, women's ability to determine and decide their own destiny. It's built on a base of policy or right that's supposed to be codified within the 14th Amendment that has never been fully realized for most people that it was intended for. So I just want to be real clear that Roe versus Wade being struck down is horrible, and we know what the consequences are going to be. It's going to be a public health nightmare. It's going to be a legal crisis for those states that are struggling to hold on to their state level abortion protection and abortion access, legal abortion. But what I'm real clear about is that the striking of this law now is an opportunity for us to work differently to build a real body of rights and protections for women's human rights in the United States, full stop. So in the face of this decision, what women are going to do now is first start to figure out how to protect themselves from unintended pregnancies. The first thing that we have to do is for people who are engaging in sexual activity that could end up with a pregnancy, that they become fully educated and informed about their sexual health, about their reproductive health, about their reproductive organs, their systems, their bodies, their lives, their choices, that how they engage around thinking about pregnancy is going to change. It's got to. That's the first one, is that they become informed and educated. The second thing is that they're going to need to know a whole lot more about contraception, that they're going to have to make sure that they're covered for contraception, that they're engaging in contraception, whether they plan to be pregnant or not. And then the third thing is that they're going to probably need to be paying very close attention to the different extra legal, and yes, I'm saying this intentionally because that's what's going to end up happening, that there will be extra legal processes similar to what many people know of or think of as the Underground Railroad during the enslavement times, what people can think about as what I would call the era of Jane. A lot of people still don't know. I think that there's a nice special on one of the cable networks right now on the Janes. There was an entire network of women who were risking their freedom and in some instances risking their lives to make sure that they could secretly protect women by giving them access to safer abortions during a time before Roe versus Wade was decided. So looking for those ways to have access. Now, on the real tip, what's going to happen most immediately in places like Georgia and other states that have different kinds of trigger bans or already have anti-abortion bans on the books. You know, Georgia has a 6-week ban that's been sitting there, been enjoined by lawsuits from the Feminist Women's Health Center and Sister Song and other allied groups like us. My organization, Sister Love, joined that suit with an amicus brief. That is all gone now, and that they can enact the 6-week ban in the state of Georgia, which effectively ends abortion for most people, except those who are tracking their periods, by which should not be doing so digitally anymore. The other thing that I think is really critical for folks to understand is that medication abortion, or what some people even now call the the period pill, right? I think a really proactive way of thinking of the current medication abortion, also known in the way of the names of the drugs, which are mifepristol. I always get them mixed up. I call them the M&Ms. Misoprostol and mifepristone are the two combination drugs that can bring down a period up to 10 weeks in a pregnancy. The fact that we could call them period pills so that we can focus on menstruation and controlling menstruation and controlling fertility that way might be a next strategy. The big thing, though, I believe, is that what we are going to see, what women will do, is find ways to not have the children that they don't want to have and taking ultimate risks to do that. Some of the lower risks might be needing to borrow money from people from whom they may not feel safe, needing to travel across multiple states to reach a state where accessing abortion is still accessible, but costing thousands of dollars, using what they can look forward to in terms of the greater risk is using unsavory folks to provide the services that they need. I was watching a video the other day that says, those of us who are in the service part of things, including my organization, have to start thinking the way, analog, have to start thinking the way drug dealers are thinking, and that we're able to distribute things way offline so that we're not trackable, that we're actually going to be unapologetically aiding and abetting abortions in an era of criminalization. So these are the things that people can look forward to, not just the women who could be, or the people who could become pregnant, but the people who want to advocate, support, and work with those folks. Don't forget, we've got laws already that will allow people to basically become vigilantes that would be paid to surveil people's reproductive health behaviors. This is where we are.
What does that mean? What do you mean by that?
So the Texas law, SB 8, which has also been repeated by multiple states, currently will pay everyday citizens who see a Uber driver driving a woman to an abortion clinic. They could report that person or sue that person for a maximum of $10,000. They could sue the person who is seeking an abortion. They could sue the person who is giving an abortion. They could sue the person who provides information to how to get to another state for that abortion. So the idea that we have laws that are basically deputizing everyday citizens to surveil and track the reproductive health behaviors of people who can become pregnant in order to get paid, but basically to force pregnancy on people who obviously don't want to be pregnant is real. And there's also, this is the other frontier that I think that we're missing. What I want women to not do is to go to these places called crisis pregnancy centers. I want them not to be caught up in the okie doke of what these people really are, which is anti-abortion fake clinics that are designed to provide misinformation, disinformation, lies, shame, stigma, guilt. You name all of the negative impressions that you could put on somebody to change their minds from terminating a pregnancy. These crisis pregnancy centers have been set up, have been systematized, have been funded in the state of Georgia to the tune of about $2 million plus in the state budget for 89 clinics that are not clinics, right? And that lie to people and don't provide actual health care services. There are laws that are currently sitting on states' books, and they will become copycat laws across all of the anti-abortion states, I predict, that will begin to require bona fide, certified clinicians, doctors, people who have sworn to the Hippocratic Oath. It will require them to refer clients who are seeking to terminate their pregnancies. They will be required by law to send them to these fake clinics for services. That's what we want people not to do, is fall into this trap, because these people are also set up to data mine, to share their personal and reproductive health information to the larger anti-abortion faction. We are at war over our own bodies. And that's what women have to recognize, that every decision you make, every conversation you have, every Google search you make will lead them to you if you are seeking an abortion in an area where abortion has now been deemed illegal because of the fall of Roe.
Oh, my goodness. The challenges, for sure. Dazon, thanks so much for all that detailed analysis. I do want to ask, however, why is there this opposition to abortion? What is the rationale behind that?
There's lots. There's many layers. Some of them are quite insidious. Some of them would not be surprising. The first one is, which I think is the most fake, is the issue of religion, right? I think that that's actually the red herring, that they use religion. The abortion is not in the Bible anywhere. So that they use religion, for example, to justify a desire, a need to have control over people's bodies, right? They use religion to justify slavery. They use religion to justify anti-homosexual, bisexual, queer life. They use, or to make it illegal or unequal at the least, at the lower end of the impacts. They use religion to justify why women shouldn't even have equal status or equal rights. So using religion is a ruse to control and to have power over other people's bodies and lives. So that's one, believing in Christianity, believing in something that gives you an existential reason to tell other people what to do and to hold judgment. That's one. The second one, I think, though, which is even more egregious, is the people who are anti-abortion in true faith and in true faction and in reality in the world, they're not my enemy. Let me just be clear about that. The people who are anti-abortion but are not anti-choice are the folks that we really need to focus in on. These are people who for themselves recognize that abortion may not be something they would support or that they agree with, but that because they believe in bodily autonomy, that they believe the same people who would want to fight for their right to not be forced into a COVID-19 vaccine should be the same people who believe that you should not be forced into pregnancy, right? So there's another group of folks out there, I think, that are anti-abortion and are fighting in that way, but are not being heard fully because they're drowned out by the so-called pro-life moniker and brand. But here's the real thing. Racism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. Those are the frameworks that drive just about everything, including the capitalism in our country. So from a capitalist, cynical standpoint, it's obviously about the money, right? It's obviously about how much women are in the workplace. It's about where women's economic power is given benefit by abortion, by having the ability to control my own destiny. More women graduate from college because of abortion. More women enter the workforce and have meaningful contributions to our economy because of abortion. More women have the ability to sustain themselves economically because of abortion. If we take abortion away, that makes them more dependent on their male counterparts, that makes them more a part of the working class to take on lower paying, less freeing, more controlling jobs that the ruling class needs us to work.
You're listening to the Just Peace program on WRFG Atlanta.
The third thing, which I think is the real reason, this is the real reason, is because white people have a negative birth rate in the United States. And for those who are in power, they clearly recognize that within 20 years, the United States will be blacker, browner, and younger, and probably more female. And that in and of itself cannot happen in a situation within which white men in class and power have to hold on to what they have built over the last 300 years, 400 years, right? So in order to do that, they have to restrict white women's ability to terminate pregnancies. That's why contraception will be next on the block, because preventing pregnancy is also a no-no in their eyes. Now, what's insidious about this is that it also means the extra benefit to that is that we can restrict abortion for Black, brown, and poor people, because that will keep them poor, because that's what we need as well. That will keep them poor. They can be cannon fodder for the ongoing argument against Medicaid, against welfare, against the food assistance programs, against housing assistance programs. It can go on and on from there. But the fact that we need to make sure that white women continue having more babies than they have now is really what this is about. And that using a cynically racial approach by restricting it in face for Black and brown women is what is the most infuriating about all of this. And what infuriates me the most is that seems to be the argument that for all of a sudden, white feminists, white women who are picking up the reproductive justice mantra are beginning to use, when what they should really be fighting for is the right for white women to determine their own destinies, regardless of what power and control the white men in their lives have. And the reason it's on them is because all of this is because of the vote in 2016 and in 2020. We already know that more than half the white women in the United States voted for the last president twice and for his kind, right? And I don't think that we should be feeling better about the fact that maybe DeSantis out of Florida is polling 1 or 2 points ahead of Donald Trump for the 2024 election right now, because DeSantis would be worse. So that's where I think the real reasons for this whole fight to end Roe and why people are anti-abortion is because, one, they're afraid. They're afraid of what will happen in the United States when we actually become that truly diverse, inclusive, and representative society of who we have always been and who we were supposed to be. The minute I hear somebody say, this is not who we are, I just want to knock them upside the head and have them go back and read the people's history of the United States. This is who we have always been. And until we sit down and realize that there's a lot more work that has to be done to dismantle white supremacy and patriarchy, that all of these issues will only continue to fall against us and not for us.
Oh, Dazon, what a incredible analysis of all that. Thank you so much. Okay, so one of my questions also is about sex education in schools. What is the status of that? Is it being taught at all? It's not much, right?
It's abysmal, and it's inaccurate, and it's on purpose. So sexual health education in schools, I think, in an ideal situation, is how it should be. It's where it should happen. Sexual health education should be normalized. It should be acculturated in such a way that it is integrated and intersected in every level of human development, that we have an understanding, just as much as we have an understanding about why you lose your teeth when you grow teeth and then you lose teeth, and how do you make sure that you don't lose your teeth when you get older? How do you prevent that? How do you make sure that you take care of yourself? Look both ways before you cross the street. There's all kinds of information. I'm not old enough to drive, but I'm supposed to understand how a car works so I don't get hit by one. There's nothing that says that we shouldn't be talking about human development and making sexual health and sexual health literacy and reproductive health literacy a part of who we are. My parents, I grew up in a house of biologists. So understanding my body parts, all of them, and how they work and what they do and when they're supposed to do certain things at certain times was normalized, right? Normalized. And that's not what we have today. And what I don't trust is that because we have a school system that leaves so much of the control of the curriculum to the states and in a lot of ways to the local schools, districts, that you will never have an appropriate sexual health and reproductive health literate generation simply because we're leaving it up to the whims of people based on their own beliefs, their own fears, and their own ignorance around sex and sexuality. So I think, the case of where we are now is, at least in the state of Georgia, it's still very much abstinence only or abstinence based, which we all know from science that abstinence does not protect or prevent people from unintended pregnancies or sexually transmitted infections or HIV as a sexually transmitted infection. So what I think, of course, is that if we don't have a national educational policy that requires certain core elements, not just in sexual health, but across the board, including the true history of our country, because that's what we're talking about, the true socio, geo, eco, and cultural politics of the history and the contemporary state of the United States, then we're going to be falling behind. Sexual health education is not provided in all of our schools. When it is inaccurate. It is intentionally misinforming and disinforming and growingly worse. Not only that, it also fails to include gender expansive people, gays, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer folk. It does not appropriately address issues of sexual fluidity. It doesn't do any of that, right? And so it's not comprehensive, it's not accurate, and it is inappropriate to deal with the sexual and reproductive health care and health rights. My belief is that we should have a full, comprehensive community sexual health education approach that addresses the whole of everybody, because most people have not gotten appropriate sexual health education. I can sit around a table with 7 people and I can tell you 6 out of those 7 people, their parents, their mothers, their grandmothers never sat and talked with them about their menstruation in a real way, never sat and talked with them about orgasms or about ovulation or any of those things in a meaningful way, never talked for real about sexual pleasure in a way that was meaningful and affirming and empowering, giving agency to folks around their own sexual health and proclivities and their desires. So I believe that if we did it at the community level, that means now we're engaging everybody. We're engaging the schools, we're engaging the administrators, we're engaging the families, the parents, the shopkeepers, the faith leaders, the business leaders, where we would be able to have real conversations at a community level for whom the sexual health and well-being of its residents matter just as much as their voting matters, just as much as their education overall matters, just as much as their ability to contribute economically as well as socially and culturally to our society matters. So that's what I think where we have to be going when it comes to sexual health and education, because if we don't think that it plays a role in saving people's lives, then we have also not been living in the country or on this planet for the last 150, 200 years.
Wow. Again, an amazing explanation and analysis of all this. So, but my question also, as far as sex education is concerned, I appreciate you also talking about not just in the school system, but within the family itself. But when should girls in particular start learning about this? At what age? When should we start learning?
So, children, have you ever noticed that children love babies? Like babies love babies.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. So when they as soon as they're able to talk, as soon as they're able to understand and ask a question, they don't have to understand the physiology of sexual intercourse, right? They don't have to go through all of that. They can learn that a few years later, right? Or maybe several years later. But we cannot pretend like they don't know that there's a new human being here that came here somehow. And I think treating children, but I'm also one of those, and I could be excoriated for this. I'm also one of those that I don't think you should be telling children about Santa Claus and about the Easter Bunny and about all of these other things that people hang a whole lot of capitalist intentions around when it's not real and it's only going to be meaningful in order for them to consume things, right? So I just don't think that it's fair to leave them out of the same way I feel about financial literacy. I don't think you wait until it's time for them to go get a job that we start talking about money, because money is also a part of our problem in the world, but especially in the United States and our relationships to it. So I say the minute they start talking, the minute they can ask questions about a baby, we're not supposed to lie to them. The minute they want to know what mom and dad are doing and making all those noises, we're not supposed to be lying to them. I'm not going to tell you how to tell them. I'm saying it's not effective and it's not useful. And in some instances, it can become dangerous, right? Because if we haven't told them about how to protect themselves, then that's how we get more incest. That's how we get more pedophilia. It's how we get more sexual molestation of children, because they don't even know what to say. They don't know how to say it. They don't know what to tell people about it because we haven't educated them. We haven't even given them the language or the tools. So again, when I say that sexual health education is life-saving, I think it starts when they can start talking and asking questions.
That makes sense. Absolutely. So has Sister Song or Sister Love, have you all had this dialogue? I'm sure you've had this dialogue about this, about education. But have you developed any policies or have articles that people can look at or whatever? Could you share some of that as well, Dazon?
So we don't necessarily we've worked on policies around sexual health education. Honestly, you sort of have to choose your battles and work within the system that you have, work within the capacities that you have. And so we haven't written any policies or started any programs about specifically how to talk to, a 3-year-old about sexual health education. Not yet, right? But we absolutely work with adolescents and we work with teenagers as well as with young adults and with parents and everybody about understanding our sexual and reproductive health systems, about our bodies. We have an intervention that's called the Healthy Love Party, which is meant to be and has been not meant to be, but has been determined an effective intervention by the Centers for Disease Control in terms of HIV prevention. But within it, we include a lot more education about your reproductive anatomy, about reproductive and sexual health, about all the sexually transmitted infections, the intersections with gender-based violence, and or domestic violence and sexual health and reproductive health. So we've created this intervention that is adapted to talk to different audiences and groups. We also work with young people in terms of advocacy and leadership in sexual and reproductive health. For example, our Healthy Love Youth Fellows, we had a cohort, I think, of about 12 high school and college-age students who, among them, 2 of those high school students who were fellows started reproductive justice advocacy groups in their high school campuses before they graduated. So they were able to move the needle further in their own schools than the rest of us have been able to in terms of moving the school board. We've had those fights with the school boards. We've done a lot of work on bringing different curriculum, and it's still an uphill battle. So we don't have those specific policies. I mean, we're in the state of Georgia that denies and declines receiving the resources from the federal government to do comprehensive sexual health education in our schools, for example, simply because they don't want to participate in the National Youth Risk Behavioral Survey, right? There's a national survey that is used to track the sexual and reproductive health behaviors of young people in the country so that we have a good sense of where the health challenges are. That's what public health is about. State of Georgia says, we're not going to let you produce that. We're not going to do that survey of the state, and you can keep your money. And by the way, that means that we're not going to fund these services. That's the level of where we are. And so we are fighting harder on now just making sure that people understand the reproductive justice framework, and where all of these really old fights and all these old arguments have a place inside that framework, and how we reframe the conversations around them so that we may end up with more traction of getting more comprehensive sexual health education into our communities and maybe in our schools.
Dazon, I realize I didn't really ask you enough also about the organization, Sister Love and Sister Song. Now, I would like just at the end here, if you could give us a little bit of an understanding of these organizations, and if people want to get more information, what should they do? So tell us about Sister Love. Are these two organizations in existence, or is it just the one primarily?
No, they're both very, very, very solid, very built, infrastructured organizations, separate and connected. So Sister Love is the organization that I founded in 1989, initially in response to the fact that neither the HIV community picking up the issue of HIV and AIDS as a sexual and reproductive health and rights issue, and likewise having sexual and reproductive health and rights movement that would not pick up HIV as an issue for sexual and reproductive health. So that's where Sister Love got started, was we are that intersectional organization. And by the way, we got started in the same year that Kimberly Crenshaw even coined intersectionality. So we didn't even have language for it. We just understood, especially for Black women, that HIV and our reproductive health were hand in hand. And it was AIDS at that time. And largely because the very first client that we had who had been diagnosed with AIDS was diagnosed when she was denied a tubal ligation at a hospital in South Carolina because they didn't want to touch her, right? So that obviously is an issue of reproductive justice, not just reproductive health access. And so that's where we became involved in this whole notion of what looks different from a reproductive rights perspective. And that's how we ended up, especially for Black and brown women, because of all these other intersections. That's how we ended up being a part of the reproductive justice movement. And as a part of the reproductive justice movement, Sister Love, my organization, was one of 16 organizations led by women of color that created Sister Song. So my organization is a co-founding member of Sister Song. And that's how it all happens. Now, what we make sure, this is for all my folks in Atlanta, is that we just add to the confusion with love a little bit more by sharing the same space. So the original home of the Black Women's Health Imperative, at that time, they were called the National Black Women's Health Project, and they were located in a building that we now call the Mother House over on Ralph David Abernathy in the West End. Sister Song and Sister Love co-own that building, and we share it together because it is not only historical, but it is sentimentally a part of our movement for Black women's lives, and by extension for women of color in the United States with regard to our sexual health and rights. To round that out, so Sister Love got started in HIV and reproductive health and rights, and where we are now, and we started out just in terms of doing education, prevention, and support services for women living with HIV. Where we are now is we still do that. So we intersect at service and advocacy because we believe that the people like Ayanna Pressley, Congresswoman from Massachusetts, says more brilliantly than anything I've ever heard other than Bob Marley. What Ayanna says is that the people who are closest to the pain must be the closest to the power, right? And so we believe that those who need our services should also be the people who lead in our fight to protect those services. So we not only provide direct services, testing, counseling, linkage to care, we're about to put a sexual health mobile unit on the street in the next few weeks, by the way. So look for the Health Love bus. It'll be a big, beautiful purple bus coming down your street offering sexual and reproductive health services. But in addition to that, we have a policy and advocacy program where we do a lot of our work on policy issues as well as mobilization and organizing folks. We have a very robust research program because we need more community-led research happening. We need more women of color who are doing research on sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. And so we can't continue to beat our heads up against the academics and against the institutions. So we started our own sexual and reproductive health rights and justice research program that is extremely robust and active with about 17 studies right now. We also work in the international space, which is what brings me to South Africa, because we have an office here that'll be 23 years old by the end of this year. And we also make sure that our leadership work is centered on the populations that have presented their needs to us the most. So we have a whole program that's built on learning from and mentoring and leading with people who are living with HIV, especially women, people who are LGBTQ experienced, people who are youth, all of whom have a need inside the margins around sexual and reproductive health rights and justice. And we do that in large part, sometimes collaboratively with Sister Song. One of our collaborations, for example, with Sister Song is around the reproductive justice framework that has changed how we talk about Black maternal mortality in the U.S. We are part of Black Mamas Matter and Trust Black Women, which are two huge campaigns and initiatives of Sister Song. So you see, we collaborate, we partner, and we live together. I hope that helps people understand who we are as separate organizations and also who we are as collaborating partners.
Dazon Dixon Diallo, I can't tell you how much I appreciate your profound analysis and details about all this. It's so incredibly appreciated. Thank you so much. So, and when are you coming back from South Africa?
I'll be back mid-July.
That's right, mid-July. All right. Mm-hmm. Dazon, thank you so much.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you so much. Hopefully we'll have more to talk about. Next week, I go to the 10th African Conference on Sexual Health and Rights. It's coming with a very strong focus on youth. And this is important because I don't know if people understand that Africa probably has the biggest youth bulge on the whole planet, which means the future will look very, very different because mostly young people will be leading this continent into the future. I talked about it on my show this week. I learned a fact that I don't know how I missed it, Heather, that 77% of Uganda is under the age of 25.
Wow.
I think that's a large part of the epidemic, quite frankly, the HIV epidemic.
Okay.
But it's also because of the issues around women's bodily autonomy, access to contraceptives, access to abortion, safe and legal abortion that's been denied, that there are all of these kinds of issues that lead us to creating different kinds of communities and economies that I don't think the world is prepared for.
Well, there's a lot there to talk about as well, obviously. So.
Yeah, we'll talk again.